And Prince was here earlier. Armstrong, I don't think he's here now. He helped us set up today. But this group has as part of our purpose, as part of the Clay County for Inclusion, a responsibility to provide opportunities for learning in our community. And so our part of fulfilling the mission of this group is to figure out ways to have programs that will entice people to come to listen, but also be a revelation, be something that we will learn, hopefully something new that we didn't know otherwise. So we organized this group to come with us today. Dr. Rodney Smith from Jewell College is going to moderate the discussion with Gina, Pastor Gina, and Weagley. Rob was professor at University of Ecclesia, and this group is going to share with us stories about the Jim Crow era and get into a discussion about that. And then we're going to take a short break, and Maggie Nurrenbern is going to come and talk to us. She's the state representative from District 15 about current events going on in Jefferson City that relate to what we're talking about today. How do we make sure that we make sure that good education is occurring in our schools, and how do we make sure that rights are being fulfilled as a part of our mission of human beings working together in a constructive and positive way. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Dr. Rodney Smith. He's going to get this thing going. Appreciation for learning from our parents in order that we could have a better future. I also use the analogy that when you go to the doctor, you go to your senior physician, and they would ask you a question of your family's medical history. So why is that? Why do you suggest that they do that?
Well, they're trying to find your history and perhaps what kinds of ailments are in your family so they can better treat you today. I look at the same with regard to our country. If we don't take a look at some of our ailments of the past, then perhaps we may stumble upon them again in the future. So I think that there is value, there's purchase, if you will, in examining. I think we're negligent if we don't examine history as we, formulate our steps today. So I think my job is again to facilitate the conversation, to get us to our wonderful guests that we have on stage. But allow me to set the stage, if you will, with regard to history in an American context. I'm going to try to, in a minute, crystallize America's history, starting at 1607 with the founding of Jamestown. I don't use 1776 as the founding of America because 1607 is when the first colony was established, that then eventually spawned the other colonies that created the first 13, and then eventually created Jamestown. And in that, we know what happens in 1607, the beginnings of Native American betrayal.
Yeah.
In 1607, that in many regards is still in play today. Right? But for the sake of this timeline, if you will, in my mind, I'll take that 1607 all the way to 1619. And we all know what happens in 1619. This privateer slave ship called the White Lion, with 60 or 20 and some odd African souls, reached the shores of Virginia, Jamestown. In fact, a year before the Mayflower. Let's put that in context. We often talk about it. We run back to the Mayflower, but we don't even know, many of us don't even know the name of the ship that brought the enslaved Africans. It was called the White Lion in 1619. And so now, 1619 begins this era in our country. We know it as American chattel slavery. Chattel meaning humans have now been transformed into property. First time on the globe. That, just imagine, if you're an enslaved African who was born in 1741, or even 1776, the year that we laud as the beginnings of our freedoms here in this country. Just imagine an enslaved African who was born in that same year. Slavery would have existed 100 years prior to their birth, and it would still be in place another 100 years after their birth. So let's just put that in context about when we want to laud these egalitarianisms that supposedly undergirds our country. Right? So again, we have to think critically about this timeline. So the timeline takes us into 1863, when we have the Emancipation Proclamation. And that is to free the African body in America. So let's go back. Let's look at the time span from 1619 to 1863. If my math is correct, that is 244 years. But then let's go back to 1607, which is 12 years before 1619. So let's add that together. What's that? 335. Right? If we move that to 1863, it ushers in what we now know as the Jim Crow era. Legalized segregation lasts from 1863 to 1954. We use 1954 because that's when we have Brown Grocers, the Topeka Board of Education, 1954. We often think, my wife who just, I thought she was called that. She's walking in now as we speak. My wife and I often talks about, we often talk about this idea of racial reconciliation in America. But that timeline suggests there's not been conciliation for us to reconcile. So I would argue that we're attempting to have racial alliance, perhaps, after 340-something years of active racial opposition. Active racial opposition from the beginning of our country, 1607. And so, in that regard of us doing these kinds of things, it's a very it's young. It's very young that we are having these kinds of conversations across racial lines in an attempt to create racial alliance. So we've had 347 years of active racial opposition, as opposed to now 2022 makes it 68 years of any attempt at racial alliance. So again, I just wanted to set that timeline in our minds, and then talk about the lasting of this active racial opposition in our country. So joining us today, we have Pastor Houston, Gina Houston, who I'll toss it to her as she begins to share with you the stories of her life and introduce herself too. But as she introduces herself, I would ask her to offer your first memory, your earliest memory of how segregation impacted your life.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I recall being raised in the church, and the privilege that I came to know as a child of attending Sunday school was that we each got a quarter after Sunday school. We got 50 cents. We put 1 quarter in and 1 quarter to leave First Baptist Church on North Gallatin and play hopscotch, jump, run, and make it down to the town square. And so with that other half of that 50 cents, that 1 quarter was where my first recollection of feeling that was because I could not enter in to spend the 1 quarter that I had left over from Sunday school. That happened to be the Babe's Drug Store. And so while I was yet learning at the First Baptist Church, yes, Jesus loves me, then I had to deal with, the Bible tells me so, but right now I only feel like it's Jesus and my mother. Because I'm experiencing that I can't go in Babe's drugstore. I can't get my cherry coke. I can give it and it's carried out to me. But I can't enter in as a patron. So that was the first reality, the first awakening of something's not quite right if Jesus loves me, because the Bible tells me so.
All right. That's a lot. Yeah, we're going to come back to that. We're going to come back to that. No, because that really means something to many of us, or not all of us in this room, because, you know, what I had to share with you all, I'm the son of a Baptist minister, my mother, in South Carolina. So this Christian walk is something that's near and dear to my heart, who I am as an individual. But, you know, as we were preparing for today, we were talking, I think as recent as Friday, we were just talking about that era, and you know, I'm not afraid to share it. I'm only 50 years old. I just turned 50 in June, but I remember the remembrance of a time going by very vividly in South Carolina that was passed on, if you will. So that I hope that comes back up again. And if not, I'm going to try to make it come back up again. But we talking about passing on, Dr. Weagley. And you, I remember you talked about it, you shared with me today, prior to us starting the program today, of your family. As you know, as with regard to your opening remarks, if you will, you know, could you share with us what your family's views were?
I could go on for too long talking about it. I counted today, my family, my mother's parents' families, One of them arrived in Clay County in 1832. They arrived with 12 slaves and 5 sons from Kentucky. They settled on a farm which is now over on 76th Street on the other side of 105 farms. Out of the farm. And with very back part. I did not even know that existed until about 3 years ago. I knew he was a Davidson. I knew somewhere from Pleasant Valley, whatever. That's that side of the family. The other side of the family, my great-great-grandmother, Granny Murray, when she was 16 years old, she got married to a man called Ephraim Murray down in Independence, and they moved here to Liberty. Granny is this picture here. And I thought she needed to hear this.
All right.
So I brought her along just for a little bit of show and tell. Granny can I tell some stories? Granny had 3 boys and 1 daughter. The daughter, which was my great-grandmother. But one of the sons was Newton Murray. He went by the name of Plunk. When he was 14 years old, he joined Buddy Bill to ride with Buddy Bill Anderson prior to the Civil War and during the Civil War. He joined because he was only 14 years old. He couldn't enlist in the Confederate Army. He barely weighed 100 pounds. But he got the name Plunk because he could shoot a Union soldier plunk between the eyes. He supposedly was a very good shot. He participated in the Centralia Massacre. I'm not proud of this, but he did. Which is where they stripped down all the Union soldiers, had to take off all the clothes so they could murder them, take their clothes and dress in their clothes so they could enter into the Union soldier camps and then kill Union soldiers. I've got a great picture of him in a Union soldier. Actually, I don't. The web does. We've got a red T-shirt on that wants to make it clear what side he was written on, as far as that goes. But in looking and trying to get some data to talk about here, I came across an old letter that had been written by my grandmother's son. So his brother was writing one of his relatives down in Tennessee about Plunk. He was leading a gallant crowd of brave boys as they would draw rein on horse or fire a 6-shooter. He was what the Federals called a bushwhacker, not like the ones you had in your country, but gay and gallant, brave and true. It is true they fought under a black flag and showed no quarter to the Federals, but they were avenging the wrongs to their parents, brothers, and sisters. He is now captain of Company D, 1st Battalion, Frontier Rangers of Texas. Corps to Mason County, Texas, fighting Indians. All that do is make me feel even worse. Not only was he murdering people, trying to keep people enslaved in our country, when the war was over, he had to run for his life in Texas. He started killing Indians instead. You know, the little hobby that he might have had. Back when he died, he was buried down here in Fairview Cemetery. Some of the things, one of the stories that is folklore, at least around some people here, Granny, during the war, Union soldiers were staying at her farm, and it was at the corner of Bill and Main Street. This is where her house was. And they killed her cow to feed the troops. It angered her, so she told one of her slaves to poison their food. And the slave did as they were told, poison their food. Nobody died, everybody got sick, and they were going to hang her. When they took her out to the front of the yard to hang her, and they're putting the gallows around her neck, and they say her name, an officer in the crowd says, "Are you any relation to Plunk Murray?" She goes, "Yes, he's my son. Take her down. I was wounded on the battlefield. He stopped and gave me water and bound my wounds and didn't kill me." Which kind of surprised me, but it's kind of the dual nature of a human being, as far as that goes. But that did not kill her. But ever since then, she would never let any of her children wear blue clothing when they went to school. Hence, my wardrobe was pretty easy for me to figure out today. Sorry, Granny. I will have to say that the stuff I got from my grandmother, which was her grandchild, led me to believe that they had a long-term, lasting resentment towards the carpetbaggers that came here. And in reading some of the stories about that in the history of Clay County that was published in the Liberty Tribune back in the 1970s, I think part of that resentment was the fact that the general that was here even had German Hessian soldiers that were hired to go out and murder people that were not reconstructed, if you will. People that were enemies of the U.S. government. And so that was something that she didn't, the war was supposed to be over, right? But it continued to kill and continued. Murders were rampant around this town after the war. Another thing that I've read that actually surprised the heck out of me, but it was in the history. After the war, 75% of the men in Clay County were not allowed to vote because they couldn't pass the loyalty test. So 25% of the men that could vote contained every African American male in the county. For some reason, my great-great-grandfather was allowed to vote, and I cannot understand that given her. Okay? A couple of stories that again the pre-20th century. I read a story that blacks at one time were allowed to use the auditorium of the county courthouse here as a school. And evidently it was going very, very, very well. So the city had to pass a Jim Crow law. They said, hey, the Liberty Cornet Band needs a place to practice. Let them practice in the balcony of the auditorium at the same time as the school's being held. It didn't take long for the school to disappear because they couldn't teach in the auditorium. Another story, and I'll turn it back, I could go this back for it. The book of Tom's Cabin, you guys have heard of that, I'm sure. Well, the county of Clay passed a law that in order to do a performance of the play, Uncle Tom's Cabin in Clay County, you had to pay a $500 performance fee. That was in 1903. After its passing, I don't know how to call it, my great-great-uncle would be her son. The two boys that weren't plumb actually bought the Liberty Advance, which was the newspaper that competed with the Liberty Tribune. He was the editor. He wrote, every good man and woman in Clay County ought to take off their hats to our honorable county court on account of raising license for Uncle Tom's Cabin to $500 per performance. They have never done anything in their whole official career that pleases us so much as this. Every court in the U.S. ought to follow their example. Does that sound like anything that's going on now? Banning books, banning plays. I know that this law was still in effect 12 years later because a touring group came through Smithville, wanted to do the play, were told a $500 fee, so they decided to do a different play instead of Uncle Tom's.
Wow, you said a lot that makes me want to kind of go back to the timeline I was talking about, and then also talk about some of the complexities that you kind of broached, Pastor Houston. But many of us, when we hear Jim Crow laws, I don't think that we really intellectualize some of the things that the laws implicated for the community. So one of them is, we often hear about sundown towns. Well, of course, that is one of the Jim Crow laws, or eyeballing, reckless eyeballing. Right? It sounds silly. I mean, it's laughable. It is literally laughable where an African American individual couldn't look a white person in the eye, or you couldn't walk on the same sidewalk without moving off the sidewalk, paying deference to, if you will, some of those Jim Crow laws that were established in 1865, started to be established in 1865. So what's significant about 1865? Well, it was 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation, but it's also the year where many of African Americans are beginning to find out that this proclamation had been signed 2 years prior. Right? So that's why we celebrate Juneteenth, and we relate it to 1865. Right? But it's also the year of the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment actually abolishes slavery, except for if you were convicted of a crime. Right? So now we have these laws coming into place. Reckless eyeballing. You make anything a crime. Because you're trying to recreate the system of slavery. And so that's the context in which we must understand the Jim Crow laws. But Pastor Houston you brought some complexity, and as well as Dr. Weagley, you brought some complexity into the conversation around the church. And here it is, Sunday afternoon. Many of us perhaps attended church this morning. So what was the community like with regard to the church-going community? Was it as, and I think I know the answer to the question before I even ask it, was it as segregated as it is today? Or how did we find, were there any movements, in particularly in liberty, with regard to social justice, being a part of the civil rights movement that came out of the white church as well as the black church?
Let me respond by sharing without the synergy of the experience as a child of the church. I likely would not be sitting here.
That's right.
The church, per se, was foundational in my life as a child and responsible for getting a grip on the understanding of what it meant to be sustained. Sustained by God, sustained by the love of Jesus. And I just am thankful today that in the house I have my mother with me. Mother, if you would just wave your hand. Who was primarily instrumental in making sure that I am the oldest of six, it was five at the time, that we all had clean ears and combed hair to attend that Sunday school. But that was my beginning, and the church was the structure in the black family, the foundation and the structure for us. When all of other man-made systems failed us, we were able to thrive and survive through the church, through the love, and even now as we occupy this space called Garrison School, where I was once a student, where books were sent here through hand-me-down from other schools, I can hear the symptoms of a pain through the songs of the church. I can hear my Aunt Ellen Murray even now. This is my story. This is my song. And there was a pattern of foot, praising my and she said, well, this is my story. This is my song. So Dr. Smith, it was through the antiquated rhythm of the soul of the fire that came from the nestling of the church that caused a surviving spirit in a little pigtail, nappy-head girl, born in a place called Liberty. And such that it was that my great-grandfather was a free man from Kentucky. And his entitlement was that he carried a pass in his back pocket to simply say, I'm a free man. And can you imagine carrying a license to say I'm free? I'm free to breathe, but now we hear I can't breathe. These are the reasons why people such as myself and people of color object to words like clan and girl and boy, because they have been centric in the denial of our allowance, our entitlement as people born free. So Paris Chevrolet, Madam Lees, as a young girl, introduced me to the town square, right, folks? And we sit here in anticipation of the 3 o'clock hour to get started, and a handsome white gentleman walked over to my mother and looked in her eyes. And he said, "Are you?" And she said, "Are you?" And in an instant, 60 years of Harvey's barbershop met the little girl as they grew up together. In an instant. In one instant, in one moment. But the division that has caused us to live separately has cost us a lifetime of unity that we still agree to be denied. What was you saying?
Exactly what you said. Exactly what you said. And exactly.
We're talking about the church, right?
Right. But we said on Friday, let the Spirit lead. So let it continue leading.
But I bring up those businesses here in Liberty as a little girl. When I see the age group that identifies with those businesses here in Liberty. I mean, everybody has to be from somewhere. But it wasn't until my mother remarried and we moved and left Liberty to move to Topeka that I got in my first fight. Because I was so proud of a town that wasn't so proud of me that the kids in Topeka made fun of how small the Liberty phone book was. Talk about recollection. I'm standing up for somebody that didn't stand up for me. Watch yourself. So extract out of the photo album a pigtail girl who was always told you had to be better in order to be good. You had to be better in order to measure up with others. One park to play, no pool to swim in. And then they moved, as you will know, the audience will know. They moved the only grocery store. What was it? It was a Safeway. Who remembers that in the room? They moved it, and we, those that were bound to one park and 4 blocks, Water, Gallatin, Main, Prairie, 5, Grover, without a grocery store. Yes, Jesus loves me. How are we going to like it? And so we go back, Dr. Smith, to what we learned. The foundation of our life is that build your hopes on things eternal. My grandfather would constantly say, put your hand in the unchanging hand of God. And as children, we don't understand these things. But then they would always say in the sweet by and by, you'll understand it then. And we're still trying to understand it. We're still trying to understand our differences. We're still trying to accept those things that we don't yet understand. Going back to your word, reconciliation. So how is it that I can have a lifetime dream, a lifetime dream with a bite-sized allowance, when I'm just given a portion that people and systems, socioeconomic systems want me to have. But yet we prosper. We prosper. We come to understand why even now there are marches and rallies after all of this time. Because we we had to accept each other's like significant for Clay County, have inclusion or established programs. So that we can spend the Sunday afternoons instead of washing our cars in places like this to get a grip on the thing that holds us together and let go of those things that cause us to be separate.
Along those same lines, Dr. Weagley, if you would allow me to share, our meeting on Friday, I noticed that you had some, I would describe as nervous energy around this conversation, this topic, and I think it is an extension of perhaps a family history that you casted your lives differently than your family perhaps did. You made yourself perhaps an ally to the African American community. But I think the point that I'm making, in addition to your allyship, is that a lot of times you make the assumption, and the error assumption, that our white brothers and sisters are not affected by racism. Simply because those of us who are people of color are the targets of racism, we make the error assumption that we're the only ones affected by it. But I use the analogy that whether you smoke or not, smoke cigarettes that is, you still are affected by this thing called secondhand smoke.
Right.
And that's why perhaps I think that the campaign in our society has been so successful to get us to stop smoking, because we recognize those of us who don't smoke still become ill. Mm-hmm. I think racism is the very same thing.
All right.
Those of us who are not direct targets of racism, we suffer from secondhand racism.
That's good.
Yeah, I would argue, I think, that a lot of the racism is actually a desire to preserve some form of caste system. And the caste system exists within races as well as between races. I mean, one of the stories that I came prepared to tell family stories about things that had an effect on my life. And obviously, I was not there when this happened. But when my mother took my dad, and by the way, my mom and dad were not the racist ever. My mom and dad were, I mean, she had a college education, and I'm not going to say she was perfect, but I think she did pretty daggone good. But when my mom took my dad to meet her mother, Pearl, she said to my dad, "I'd rather my daughter marry an N-word than you." Now, she was racist. That was absolutely the most racist thing that she could say, period. And to him, obviously the Weagley name did not have a very good caste at the time. And we're not going to go into any reasons for that, but I mean, there's two sides of the track, and you can find yourself on both sides sometimes, as far as that goes. They got married anyway. You know, I ended up being the only product of that marriage as far as a child goes. And I would always send her to my grandmother's house for daycare. And my grandfather was an alcoholic. And she tried to teach me, she'd always use the N-word. She'd always try to teach me how important Granny was to the rest of the world. And I have to admit, I had a little bit of pride that there was a relative of mine that I had a social ladder at some point in time. Okay? And I say high up on the social ladder because she was the one that actually unveiled the statue over in the cemetery that we're all trying to get removed. Right. And when I was looking again to try to find things that I could talk about, I came across a quote that the historian for the Daughters of the Confederacy for the state of Missouri, she gave a speech in St. Louis after she was here watching the unveiling of the statue here. And her quote just drove me crazy. As I gazed at the beautiful polished gray shaft and the bronze soldier standing at rest above it, my heart swelled with pride, for I saw another record for the future historian, as well as a memorial to the grandest race of men. The bravest soldiers that were ever banded together in the cause of righteousness, justice, and human liberty. That almost made me sick when I read it. And if there was ever a self-confession that demands for revestment and removal, to me that quote summarizes everything that we need to know of why that has nothing, that place, that ground has nothing to do with honoring the dead. The ceremony for that unveiling had 5,000 people come, bands playing. It was a celebration of whiteness. It was all it was. It was a celebration of being white. Why did we get to unveil it? Well, because it was 1904 and Jesus was still alive, being born in 1911. I mean, wasn't that many left? You know, so she was left out. She didn't contribute a dime to buying that statue. But they went around to grade schools, got money from all the kids to help build it. And the Daughters of the Confederacy, as we all remember, were the ones who were changing the textbooks and trying to get whitewash history to change what it is that we know, and we are trying to relearn that actually took place during the 400 years of slavery that existed within this country. I guess a couple of things I love when I go along with it. She told me, you know, never to touch a person of color because they're dirty. Don't get too close, they stink. Expect them to give you the right of way when you're walking down the street. Don't do business with them. It kind of surprised me a little bit, because I think I mentioned my grandfather was a drunk, and oftentimes during the day when I'd be there for daycare, I look out in the barn lot, and there would be papaws, what I call it, papaw, and 2 or 3 men from the north end, and they were just getting drunk together. So papaw's buddies were the same people she was telling me not to touch, not to get close to. It seemed like they were having a pretty good time with me, you know. And so, but you know, get that as it may. But I was really blessed in just odd sort of way. My mother would bring me to town as an example. Bring me to town. She would go away to FedEx and buy a soda for Topsy. And she'd give it to Topsy. And then Topsy would watch me while she was shopping. And I'd talk to Topsy. Those of you that remember Topsy, those were simple conversations. You know, but they were joyful, fun kind of conversations. I mean, Topsy was a man, he had love in his heart. And I remember that. And I was blessed not only that, when I started school, integration had just started. And my friend for a rock factory, I raised her up, had her grandfather was superintendent of schools and got it done that quickly in this town. And I love her and her family. Well, I love her, but I love her family as well for all this stuff that in fact happens. But you go to school and you try to spot her walking across the street, and you kind of want to pull back. What a cool, friendly human being. What a great janitor. What an overeducated human being to be doing this wonderful, beautiful job that he was doing for us children. Because we all learned a lot that he wasn't getting paid to teach us, which was to accept each other. But the thing that was really kind of odd, which is unique, everybody got to meet China. But after school, my bus would drop me off at the county health department. Because our house was only about a half a block from it. Up by remember the Jerry Joy old folks? At the corner of 52 and 69 Highway at the time. Well, our house was right around that corner. So they dropped me off there. Mom worked part-time at the county health department. And what I got to do was hang around with him. Because he's cleaning the place up. I'd walk around with him and move chairs so he could sweep and do whatever and chat with him. Well, he's just as human, if not more human, than a lot of the white guys that I knew, right? And I never thought anything about it until you keep learning, and that she's keep trying to teach me the stuff that I don't really want to know. And I guess one of the things that really struck me, and this is going to sound odd, I think, but when I said it once, AJ embraced it. When I said it, so it must not be too far off the mark. So any of you remember the football player by the name of Charlie Lee? She was absolutely a wonderful football player. And all the white guys wanted to be as good as he was. But we couldn't be as good as he was. But that thought, recognize and see that people of my color emulated a person of his color was a freeing experience. Does that make any sense to you? It made sense to me when I was a young child. I had friends in school that were African American. Helen Burley, Robert Houston are two that come to mind that I remember a lot. I know that they were in my house for a party or two because my parents like to go out and I'd like to have friend people in. I was pretty social as I was in high school. And I noticed that they were not as comfortable as all the white people were, probably because this was a new experience for them. And as I think back on it now, what's one black guy with a group of about 30 white people? What's that remind you of? You know, you start looking around for a tree or what? I mean, there's some serious history that's going on in memories with the culture that we're putting in. One of my friends in high school was a man by the name of Mike Fields. Any of you remember Mike? Yeah, Molly does. And he hangs on us like it was life. Good for him. Good for him. Mike was at one of the parties at my house. And it got late. Everybody was leaving. Also, the friend that Mike didn't have a ride home. So he wanted to know if I could go ride home. I said, Mike, it's late. You know, just spend the night here and I'll take you home in the morning. Seemed like a reasonable answer. I mean, if it would have been Tom Harris, it would have been okay, right, guys? Or Pat Thomas. Would have been no problem. That was on a Saturday night. Well, on Sunday, Pearl, you know, I wasn't paying attention over here. She came over for a Sunday dinner, you know, fried chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, the same thing. And she found out that he had spent the night over there, that she was leaving him, and she was spending the night at our house. And she went ballistic. It's 1968. I repeat, it's 1968. I'm 16 years old. Who else goes ballistic? I go ballistic. Before it's over, she said, well, if you don't disavow your friendship with Mr. Fields, I'm going to disown you. And I said, fine. Go ahead and disown me. Next week she did. A week after that, actually 2 weeks after that, she died without a grandson. You know, and that was it was an emotional moment. I'd do it again. Frankly, to me, as a person, it really made very little difference in terms of what my life was going to be like after that, as far as the finances. But the emotions of being disowned by your grandmother because you have people of color that are friends of yours is amazing. Now, I'm going to cross the line here potentially. Mike was one of the early casualties of HIV/AIDS in the Kansas City area. And I don't know for a fact his sexual preference. I just know for a fact it's how he died. But I would know that if that would have been tied in with his color in this conversation, if he were in fact to be gay, I mean, she wouldn't have even waited a day to go down to change her will. I mean, the need for inclusion is great in our country. You know, for people of color, for people of born differently than other people were, people that are immigrating. It's an incredible issue that we're trying to learn from our past. To look into the future that's brighter.
Yeah, your comments made me, and I'm going to close here. Your comments made me think of our conversation on Friday again, when I had not met these two wonderful people before, and we had a Zoom meeting set up, and when they got on Zoom, I shared with them, I said, I was expecting people who will be much older. You understand? Because you think of...
AJ is older.
But when you think of, segregation, you think of a time, long time ago. Like, I think the point I'm making is that I often say, my wife and I often say, well, history isn't that far ago. It's not that long ago. All right. And you got people in this audience and on this stage who experienced it, it is not that long ago. And we can't divorce ourselves from that.
Correct.
It is a part of who we are, and we are much better if we address those things as opposed to ignore those things. Because I don't know of any issues or concerns that we've ever had in society that have been fixed by us ignoring it.
That's right. That's right.
And so, we have to continue to fight our way through the pushback that we will receive as a result of what we are attempting to do here in creating a racial alliance across differences, and we begin to celebrate our differences that we are born with. So I'd love to. I heard you. You wanted to offer a comment? Yes.
When we began to put some labor behind the work to remove the monument, I got invited to be included in that song, that work. And from that time until now, I think it's important that we understand what is at stake if we don't take action. For me, Dr. Smith, for me, Dr. Weagley, I hear the ancestral voices from the unmarked graves. Those voices were once choked out from making a sound. Their names, their markers, now recorded above ground, and they will have a new place found. Thank you for your help to sing that song with us as we proclaim victory around the destruction and removal of that monument.
So I think we're at a point in the program where we can entertain questions from the audience, if there are any comments, questions, concerns, emotional outbursts.
Mike's here.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Step up to the mic.
Please.
Well, you don't have to.
Wait,
If somebody would rather not.
wait,
Wonderful. I have a question.
Sure.
One of the last remarks that you made was anticipating the pushback from this kind of an event or this kind of working together. Could you elaborate on that? Because in my ignorance, I don't understand the pushback. I don't understand that.
Well, I guess I was making reference to some in our community who would suggest that we shouldn't look back. That we should not look back, that we should not refer to history. Like, there's been, in some regards, a campaign throughout our country to get us to not talk about what is being sort of blanketly called critical race theory, CRT, that is being called, which is, in some regards, my interpretation, a pushback against history. Pushback, because the truth of the matter is the actual theory, critical race theory, is not taught anywhere other than law school, graduate school. When I was working towards my doctorate, yes, it came up as a theory, but in our K-12 school systems and even in undergrad, the theory itself, which was brought to light by scholars like Derek Bell, or Richard Delgado, or Dr. Michelle Crenshaw, that's not talked about. I think what the pushback is, we're bringing up things like Jim Crow, like slavery, and not want to revisit that painful part of our past.
And I understand that, and I hear that.
Yeah.
I was like, I guess where I was coming from is looking at expanding this type of event into a larger audience Are you do you have plans to do that, number one? And second of all, is there a lot of pushback? Is that a fight to do that?
Well, I don't. I can't answer that intelligently. I think Marty would be a better person to help us respond to that question. But I think I'm just speaking in general terms collectively across the country, where you have even some people attempting to levy legislation to stop schools and school districts from teaching American history, basically.
Is this the best way to fight that? Having this discourse? Having broader?
It's one of the ways, but I think that, you know, I'm hesitant to say it's perhaps the best way, but I think it's one of the ways because we all know that movements require a lot of different players and a lot of different roles in the movement, you know, and so I think that us continue to forge forward, but having these kinds of conversations is definitely a part of, but, you know, we should have additional ways to fight this battle.
I can spin off that just a second since you did have a conversation.
Yes, absolutely. More
It has to do with the Clay Counties for Inclusion. I think that your question as a group that is working at trying to help provide a better understanding of humanity in the broadest sense in our community and then reach out even further. So, in response directly to your question, yes, we want to grow this communication. We want to grow this opportunity to learn these stories because when we hear from Rob and Gina and Rodney about their stories, they resonate with a lot of folks here, and they educate others of us who haven't experienced those things so that we can be more intelligent as human beings to live and work in this world and to advocate for people like Karen Rogers for the school board in Liberty Public Schools. And you're going to hear a little bit from Maggie Nurrenbern about what's going on in Jeff City that this group can write to your state senator or your state legislator to help make sure that we advocate for humanity, not for the wideness of our humanity and the breadth of our humanity, not the narrowness that some people are advocating for. After all, those of you who are of the Christian faith, this is Transfiguration Sunday. Just take a moment to think about that and how that needs to resonate with the work we have to do as human beings. That's
Marty, if I might just add to that, kind of goes along with what you're saying and what you asked. All of your tables, there are cards that talk about Clay County for inclusion, and they're going to be stacks of them here and out there. And we encourage you to take as many as you would like and hand them out to whomever we're trying to educate and spread the word. If you are not a member, there's a sheet on your table that you can fill out a membership. No dues, nothing like that, but you find out about programs like this. Lets you know that this is going on. And then also if you have suggestions of things you would like us to do in the future, that's on there too. So.
I'd like to say something. I just want to keep it real. The reality is that there is a counterculture in Liberty, in Clay County, in the United States of America that want to maintain the status quo. They don't want inclusion because in their opinion, inclusion means that they are diminished. To lift someone else up means that they are diminished. And so they are pushing and fighting against that. And so you have to expect, when you attend events like this, when your name goes on a list as a member, when they see your name mentioned in the school board or the city council, that there's a mark by hopefully link arms with us to fight against it. Because the fight is real, and the only way it's going to change is that it's going to change with each and every one of us, individually and collectively, making a decision that we're no longer going to allow it to continue to fester and to grow. Thank you.
Piggybacking on what you're saying, I'm a 3.5 years retired teacher from Liberty and got to work in Marty's building for a while. And I got to listen to music, and I got to talk about jazz, and I got to listen to all that. And hopeless, lifelong learner teacher type, I'm compelled to say that you want to turn your life upside down and read Howard Zinn's The People's History of America. You won't be the same after that. Well, lately, it's light reading. I want to hear what the hubbub is about critical race. Nobody's going to teach that anywhere because it's a big, thick tome, but I'm starting. I'm also doing the 1619 project, so enlightening, but the one that really got my attention originally was Ibram X. Kendi's book called, Stand from the Beginning. Yes. Towards the beginning of it, there's a quote by none other than Jefferson Davis. I always thought, he was a dirtbag from, he was a senator in our Congress. And he got up and said that this country is built for whites, and it's all about whites. And the others are stamped from the beginning. And it's like, holy cow. It's like, wow, where'd that come from? This guy. And then just transpose it to today, and we have our own set in Congress that says the same garbage. I'm concerned, when I work with children at the high school level, they don't know squat about anything. They really don't. And being interested in education, when Columbus came up, I was the first class dirtbag. And they got me in trouble one time with the principal, going, well, we don't read the things you read, Mr. Alstead. And it's like, no, it's true. It is. And the more I read, the more I get that. And I'm worried that a whole other generation is leaving our schools clueless. Kenny's saying that we tried 3 ways to make this work. Uplift, persuasion, where we're going to take our black friends and lift them up. But then the whites realize, this isn't in my best interest. So, that kind of fails. Kendi says, it fails every time. Then he says it's going to be sacrifice, white sacrifice. We're going to sacrifice. You take that job. I'm not going to take that. You take that job. But then eventually with the whites, it's like, that's going to cost me this promotion. So they go. Then the last one would be educational persuasion. Well, if we get better schools, we get all the African American kids up to speed in the colleges, and the whites again say, it's just not going to fly. Sorry, I have to sacrifice. So then comes the punchline. What is the answer? Kendi says, it's dealing with these institutions that perpetuate this clever thing, he says, racist ideas. Okay. He never trashes people, anybody. He just says racist ideas, like in the policing, like in education, like in business. It's baked in. He says that's where you put all the energy, and there's going to be blowback, as you're saying, when you come against these institutions that propagate racist ideas. Right. Well, it was more of a say, but curious if you have any thoughts or responses.
So, yes, absolutely. And I recommend that book. Caste, the book that you kind of made reference to. We talked about caste, Isabel Wilkerson. I think it's in the top 5 of books that addresses this subject matter. The One with Other Sons is another one that I really love. What's that? And my mom would say, White Fragility. It's the New Jim Crow. There are tons of books. But I think The nuance of your comment, and I agree with you that we have to address these issues at the systemic level, institutional level. We use words like systemic racism, institutional racism, structural racism. It is not always so blatant. It is not always in the form of hate mongering or even intentional. It comes across as, oh, it's just what we normally do. Status quo. It comes across as that person has always been in leadership. A person that looks like that person has always been in leadership. So a person that looks like the new leadership look like the old people. Right? That's the institution of the structural racism that we're talking about. How it is literally, to your point, baked into the system. And it's hard to extract butter, if you can, from a cake that's already baked. So I totally agree with your comments.
Well, we're talking about books. I just want to recommend that you download the app VoiceMap, VoiceMap. There are tours of different cities across the world. There is a tour that you follow along on your phone. You start at Shine Mission East, I think it is, high school, and that parking lot, and then it takes you through the city, and it follows what J.C. Nichols did to create neighborhoods and keep out African Americans in certain areas, and how the blockbusting went on, and it's a wonderful, wonderful tour. And it takes you through neighborhoods, it talks to you, tells you the city or streets you can turn on, and gives you some history, and you're looking at different buildings, different neighborhoods, and it's really, really good.
Yeah, the name of the program is Dividing Lines, A History of Segregation in Kansas City. And the app again is VoiceMap, and it is take you about 90 minutes to 2 hours to do it. But Sunday afternoon, there's no traffic if you're smart. But it is enlightening. I learned so much by going through that. And I don't know when we're going to close this, but I was having a talk the other day with our good friend Sheldon Potter, and this comes to my mind. He said something to me. I didn't quite understand the question, so I feigned and I backed off. I said, I'm not trying to understand, because my people were never enslaved. He goes, wow, you people are still enslaved. He said, we've been emancipated. Many other people are still trying to keep people enslaved. And that's the real slavery. And he said, even though if we're in a ditch and the white man's standing on my shoulder, we're still over in the ditch. And I gave him a walked away, because that was my job. I said, yeah.
So I think we have time for one more question, and we got to turn it over to Representative Nurrenbern. Yes.
Thank you. First, I want to say thank you for you speaking today, especially to the topic of this statute that is in the city. I'm a Jackson County legislator, and here, of course, support my friend, but this has been so wonderful, because that is one of the only 2 black legislators in Jackson County. We went through our own fight with the Andrew Jackson statute. And what's interesting is that when we talk about how, what does it look like today, and what are the struggles that we face today, I urge any of you, and I know government can be boring, but in 2020, when we were having that discussion with Jackson, and we were talking about my other colleagues, the other 7 white colleagues, there's 9 of us, talking about erasing our history, getting rid of the idea of what he did that was so good. But what was so, by the way, we weren't trying to even melt down these statutes. What we wanted to do is move them to a place where people could learn about President Jackson. And the reason that I found it so shocking and really sad thing is because of explaining the different stories, the different horrors that this president did, not only to African Americans, but to the Native Americans. But also to the point that in each courthouse, anyone who is going there to try and prove themselves innocent or to stand up for themselves has to face the man who looked to whites who did not have land and say, you're not worth it, they shouldn't have any representation. Now looked to Native Americans and said, you should not have representation. But especially looked at black people and said, you don't even have the right to even walk in this building. And over that time, they decided to put it to that that November election for people to vote. But that shows just how critical we are in our society that we're willing to say, let's not fix the problem, but we can say, well, let somebody else try to handle it. Let's not face the real history of it. And I understand completely the struggle there, and I appreciate, especially you, pastor and teacher, everything you said touched me deeply. All of you did. Just the idea that we have to face this symbolism, that we have to explain to our colleagues, and it might take a long time. It took us a long time, and we still fail. But just to realize and understand that we're not trying to erase history, we're actually trying to teach history.
Our middle in this is a little humor. When I integrated in schools in about 1960, I say almost every white person I ever knew or talked to, they were in favor of it. In fact, most of us wanted to integrate before they did. But I had a store over here about Stanfordville. And it's the only person in town I ever heard of was against integrating the schools. It was, I think it was a little boy. Stan said, well, but he's extra school start this year. So, no, he won't go to school like white kids. I mean, I hope that didn't affect him.
So, I think that I appreciate your comments, Representative. And it reminds me of my closing analogy. And my wife in the back, my son is doing this. I'm sure they know what I'm going to say. I'm joining my wife is about the house that we live in. And it would resonate with many of you because you may not be the original owners of the house that you live in now. You may not have been the person who designed it. It may be an older house. Our house is not that old. We're not the original owners. We didn't build it. But if something were to go wrong with the foundation of the house today, I'm responsible for it. I don't have the luxury of calling the original owners. I don't have the luxury of calling the designer or the builder of the house. I have to fix it. The problem in the house may not be my fault, but it's my responsibility.
Thank you, each of you, for sharing your wisdom, your insights, and giving us, in essence, a framework that build ourselves into a greater future and hopefully spread this outward. Let's give one more big round of applause. Maggie, if you could make your way up. Next, we're going to listen to the current day. In closing, what Rodney said so eloquently about the foundation requires us to make sure that we're continually looking at the world as it is, not what we think it is, but what it is accurately. And that means that all of these stories have to be lifted up, that the facts of history are all out there. All the facts of history are out there. It's up to us to uncover them and to bring them to light and use those facts to help educate and enlighten. And that's my shame as a high school principal, that I didn't do enough of that in our curriculum in the Liberty Public Schools. That is something that we've got to continue to work with, and that's why this work that we're doing with the county inclusion group is we think is important, and we're going to continue to do that. Maggie is here to tell us about how we can affect that foundation, because it's being whacked on, I guess is one way to say it, by some folks who want to narrow this liberty. I guess that's one way I can say that. They want to narrow the liberty of all human beings. And Maggie's here to share some of the legislation that's going on and answer some questions we might have. So Maggie, if you could.
Well, thank you. And before we start, I do have some handouts. I don't remember.
Oh, I'm going to start.
Yeah, if you all want to pass those out. And then being the teacher and also mom and three, if y'all need to take a break and use the restroom, they're there. So I want to make sure I say that too, because I know it gets a little bit long. So feel free to stand up and stretch. I won't call you out. But first of all, wow, that I can't tell you how many times I got goosebumps and how much their stories and what we hear today really impacts what we're doing in Jefferson City and how scary what we're doing in Jefferson City really is, and why you all being here on a beautiful Sunday afternoon matters. Because democracy as we know it, public education as we know it, basic access to voting as we know it is under a threat every single day that the Missouri General Assembly is in session. And people for a while said, gosh, Maggie, you're always being so hyperbolic. But man, you start listening, you start tuning in to what's happening, and it's scary, okay? So, if you all, did you find them already?
I'm working on it.
It's just in the middle folder, but there is a lot going on, and bill numbers get tricky, and so I thankfully have a great office staff that helped me put together just some points for you all to know where we're at, but more importantly, how to stay involved and follow what's going on, okay? So before I share this, I want to, share why the heck I would choose to go to Jefferson City, that I put my name on the ballot to do this job. So first of all, I am from Clay County. I'm from Smithville. I grew up in Smithville and went to Smithville Public Schools from kindergarten to 12th grade. As I was walking in, a lot of people recognized me and said, hey, are you Steve's daughter? My dad, Steve Wilcox, has been an attorney here in Liberty for many, many years, but more importantly, he was very invested in public education. And when they moved to Clay County, my dad got involved in the Smithville School Board and served on that school board for 12 years. My mom and dad are kind of strange people, if you know them. And for those who don't, I'm going to explain why. My mom was the daughter of a Kansas City firefighter. My grandpa was a Kansas City firefighter. So my grandpa was a Kansas City firefighter, who was captain with the Kansas City Fire Department. My great-grandpa was one of the founders of Local 42, our firefighter union, and my great-great-grandpa was the chief of police of Kansas City. My mom was the first of 6 kids to go to college. She graduated from our Kansas City High School. They grew up around right by Winnetonka High School, if you all know where that's at today. She went to the University of Missouri and was an incredible student, having had parents that always told her, you not study, but you must study, and you must do better than me, because we are working so hard to barely survive, okay? So with that being said, my grandpa worked on the clock as a firefighter. I still remember stories verbatim of him fighting fires in the West Bottoms. They didn't have the protection equipment that we have today. Every part of him was scarred in some way from his years of fighting fires. Every bone in him, I think, was still chilled to the fact that the day he retired, he moved to Florida and knew that he would spend the rest of his life in Central Florida. His feet were crushed from years of sliding down the fire pole, and so his feet were about this wide. We had to have special shoes made because during that time they didn't have what we have today. Not that we're there, but he lived a very poor life, and he knew he wanted nothing more than his kids to have a really great education. They didn't have to do that physical labor if they didn't want to. So with that being said, my mom was incredibly studious. She studied zoology at the University of Missouri, and knowing that she wanted to be a doctor. And when she applied for medical school, she got her letter of rejection back. And it said, we've already met our quota for women for the year.
Wow.
And that was one woman in a class of 100. And it was the one woman who was accepted. Of course, her father was a doctor, and her grandfather was a doctor. And they obviously were donors to the school as well. So my mom, at that time, had met this strange guy from Ludlow, Missouri, in Livingston County, named Steve Weagley. And he also was kind of a unicorn in a lot of ways, in that he had decided not to take over the family farm that had been in his family for generations, but he wanted to go to law school. And they ended up dating, and somehow they just got married one day, because that's my parents, they're strange like that. I don't think there's ever an engagement, but sure enough, they showed up and got married, and ended up having 4 kids, 4 daughters together in the span of 8 years, and they always were foster parents. My dad, for many years, and I didn't recognize this as a kid, I didn't recognize what it meant to do pro bono work. I didn't recognize what it meant to serve on school boards and so many other boards and foundations. He worked for many years, still does, for Tri-County Mental Health, and why that work was so important. My mom, if you are a woman who is educated and has studied science, then you're expected to be a science teacher, right? So she went on and she became a teacher in the Kansas City Public Schools for 5 years. She applied again for medical school at 25. She was rejected because she was too old. She then decided to go to law school with my dad, and they practiced law together for a year, and that didn't work out well because, of course, she wanted to be a doctor. So with that being said, with 4 kids at home and a foster daughter, she applied for medical school here at the University of Health Science, and she went to medical school. And some of my earliest, when we talk about earliest memories, my earliest, most vivid memory is in a gross anatomy lab. And I still can remember walking through there because probably we didn't have childcare that day or something happened, but my mom had to take some of us with her to the med school. And I remember walking through and being like, this is strange, like here I am walking through cadavers, like this is what I'm looking to. But I say all of that because my childhood was probably anything but quite unusual for a lot of reasons. But I always was in situations that were a little bit different. And I learned from a very early age to learn from those who are different from myself. My mom today continues to practice medicine. She just turned 71, and she works for University Health. For many years, she worked at first Park. Then she went to was Hospital Hill, but she's been at the Lee Summit location for quite some time. Much of her practice has been doing the jobs that nobody else wants to do. So a lot of it has been working in the county jails. She always says that was some of the patients that were most thankful to see her, for those who were incarcerated. My dad continues to practice law and wears a ton of other hats. But what they are and how they live their life was in a way of humble public service that when I went to school, and I went to Truman State, and I started thinking about what I wanted to do. And it was always to do the things that I was able to do because I had a lot of privilege. I had parents who paid for my college. I was at a Truman State University, a very white liberal arts education. But people that I was surrounded with got so in professors challenged me to see the world from a different point of view. So it was there at Truman State that I had truly my first Black friends, my first Latino friends, my first Asian Pacific Islander friends, my first friends in the LGBTQ community. Not that I didn't have those people in my orbit before, but in terms of friendships and opening up and showing how we're vulnerable to one another, that was really my first time. So with that being said, I ended up sticking around in Costa Rica. I met there a Peace Corps volunteer, and I thought, wow, I could go and for the first time live life and not be automatically accepted or granted that privilege, but have that opportunity to be so humbled that I can actually open myself up to be vulnerable. And I say that because if you, as many of you who have grown up in Clay County, everything is just, it's kind of, you can do whatever you want, right? If you push yourself hard enough, many times you can do what you want. So, with that being said, I remember talking to my parents about that and to do this. My mom, I remember when Kennedy, I still remember verbatim when he asked, not what you can do for your country, right? Or not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. I'm sorry. I butchered some of his most famous lines. Yeah, there we go. But I went into the Peace Corps, and I served for just those 2 years, 3 months of training, and then 2 years of service in Ecuador. The interesting thing about Ecuador is it has an incredibly diverse country, meaning they have a huge African Ecuadorian population. Where I lived, in just east of Quito in the Amazon basin, there's a very large Quichua population. When my brother-in-law, who's from St. Louis, he's African American, grew up near Ferguson, came to visit with my sister, the students in my classroom said, "How is that possible?" Because in Ecuador, you still to this day, if you were to marry somebody, if a mestizo person doesn't marry a mestizo person, then you're cast out. If an African Ecuadorian doesn't marry an African Ecuadorian, then you're cast out. And towns there today are incredibly segregated. Okay? It's interesting when we look at segregation here in the United States, and we shared a lot of that, right? We are still so far from being where we should be. But then you're in another country and you're like, whoa, this is like what it's like. That you literally can't love that person, right? But your family, you're not like, literally, you were dead to me is what they would say almost. So that was my experience in the Peace Corps. I come back and decided to be a teacher, and I went to UMKC, and I had studied journalism and Spanish in college, so I had to go back and kind of start over to get my teaching certificate in Spanish and ELL. And then during that time at UMKC, one of the big focuses was on working in the urban core and learning. I still remember one of the books that was like that aha moment of reading, "We can't teach what we don't know, white teachers in multicultural education." And one of the things I learned early in the Peace Corps, as somebody who had always talked a lot, was that you can't learn if you keep talking. You have to shut up and listen to others and learn from their experiences. And for me, that experience at UMKC, where many of my colleagues in my cohort were from Saudi Arabia, I couldn't keep talking and expect that I would learn as much as if I would shut up and just absorb and listen. And during that time, I toured around many schools. I did a lot of research, but more than anything is I listened to the stories of others. I went on to be a teacher for 5 years at University Academy, and during that time, University Academy is one of our first charter schools in our city, and that's a whole conversation that I'm happy to get into. It's very interesting. And it was actually under the Obama administration, really, that charter really took hold, and it was just thought like, hey, this is going to be our silver bullet. If all of a sudden we do this business model, then that's our silver bullet to education reform. We can talk about that and how problematic a lot of other schools are, in my opinion. I took there K-12. Well, I ended up just teaching pretty much in the upper school, but I went to ELL for that school and was the district coordinator for ELL. I then went in and was at North Kansas City High School. And for those of you who are familiar with both racially, ethnically, and socioeconomically. Again, talk about learning from people. We were with people from all over the world, and my colleagues in the modern language department, there were 8 of us, and 6 of the 8 were born outside of the United States. Okay? So how does all of this happen where this girl from Smithville ends up running for state representative and then what some would say, oh, this radical liberal or radical progressive on the education committee and in the budget committee and on the House floor who's always talking and never seems to shut up. Well, it was when Donald Trump was elected, and I remember going into North Kansas City High School that next day and film students running up to me and saying, how did this happen? And I still remember one young lady, and she's asked me to share a story, but Ming walks up, and beautiful woman, she's wearing her hijab, and she says to me, Miss Nurrenbern, I didn't know our country was so racist. I stopped and I said, Ming, I didn't know our country was so racist either. And then we stopped, and I had no words. And I remember we hugged, and she cried. I hugged her some more, and she cried some more. And I thought at that time, like, what am I going to do? Because all these people kept looking to me because they knew that I was always a person who was accepting, that anybody could come to me and tell me anything, whether they were homeless and living down by the river, whether they were going to come out to their parents as being gay, whether they just had an abortion last weekend, but they knew that they could come to me and I wouldn't judge them. So fast forward a couple years, and there's a seat open for the State House. With term limits now, that's something that you can more or less plan for. So I had been an intern in the Senate back in 2006. Following at the end of my kind of journey at Truman State, I decided to take an internship on a whim and had a really incredible experience. So with that seat being open, I thought, well, somebody has to do this job. Right? In Missouri, we have 163 state reps. Somebody's going to do this job. Could be another man in Clay County. We have 7 state representatives, and at the time, 7 of the 7 were white men. So somebody's going to do this job. Somebody's going to come and make those votes, or voice or not voice their concerns, how they see that that's their job to represent their constituents, or I could put myself out there and run for this seat. I had at the time when I formed my campaign committee, I had a 3-month-old, a 3-year-old, and a 5-year-old. My husband's a nurse practitioner at Samuel Rogers Health Center. He was working with JVS at the time, before Trump, I should say, when we still had refugees and immigrants coming into the country, but he is a man of incredible compassion and integrity and hard work. And when I said, hey, I want to do this, he said, okay, let's make it happen. So with that being said, I got myself into a 4-way Democratic primary, which I do not advise. But I joke that I killed everybody with kindness, and I kept meeting them at events and offering to sit down over coffee or over a beer. And eventually, I was the only one to file for that seat on the Democratic side. And sure enough, I found myself running against Steve West, who has been known and disavowed by the Republican Party for his very anti-Semitic rhetoric and stances, misogyny, homophobia. I mean, it goes across the spectrum, and thankfully he was disavowed and denounced and not allowed to file this thing around. He has run 2 cycles. With all that being said, here I find myself in the Missouri House. The Missouri House, until this year, had a supermajority super Republican power in that they could even overturn a veto, right? So even if the governor were to veto something that was too far, too extreme, they could overturn that veto without any help from Democrats. There have been, through some unfortunate circumstances, including the death of a dear colleague, one of the only openly gay Republicans, but also through the removal of a member, through several other resignations, we now do not have, for the first time in many years, there's no longer a supermajority in the House. So Democrats so we're needed. And here's why that matters. Right now, we are doing congressional redistricting. Okay? The Republicans need our vote on that map in order for it to go into effect before the August primary. Okay? So in Missouri, we have not grown for a lot of reasons. People aren't moving here, is probably one of the primary, but we have about 6 million people. We have 8 congressional seats. We have a 60-40 electorate, and that's in a statewide election, 60% in recent years have voted Republican and 40% have voted Democratic. With that being said, we should have a 5-3 map, right? Currently today, we just have Emmanuel Cleaver representing Kansas City, and he has a lot of rural area there as well. And then Congresswoman Cori Bush representing the 1st District in the city of St. Louis. That district is a majority-minority district, which is protected and thankfully protected, so they cannot carve her out. However, they are doing everything in their power to make these crazy wagon wheels, like down from like southern Kansas City all the way to Nurrenbern, would now be a congressional district. When I say that our democracy, our very democracy, is under attack, this is what I am talking about. Congressman Graves, the 6th congressional district, right, spans the entire, literally, all of the north from the west to the east of Missouri. If you are a person who disagrees with Congressman Graves and you were to call his office, you probably do not get a call back, right? If you reach out to Congressman Cleaver, it doesn't matter if you live in his district or not, and you ask him to come speak, he will be there. Or he makes sure that one of his staff members is there. If you have a concern, he or his office staff make sure that your voice and your concerns are answered. It is interesting because, when we look at these maps and we have to make all these tough decisions on what are we going to bargain with, what are we going to do here? And now I know that they're going to need our vote on something. Well, first of all, I'm never going to vote for a 7-1 map. That's ludicrous. But that's what they were trying to do, right? They were trying to carve out the 5th congressional district and make it a red district. When they start bargaining on things like, well, for voting, now we're going to require a photo ID. For voting, we're going to eliminate absentee ballots, early voting, all of these things. They cannot, and I say this with absolute certainty, they cannot expect us ever to go and vote on an emergency clause for a 6-2 map, or certainly we're not going to vote for a 7-1. But then come back and say, okay, but now you're going to vote for the photo requirement, now you're going to vote for this, now you're going to vote for this. So sometimes it feels like we truly are between a rock and a hard place, but for once, and through, I don't know, other than the grace of God, we actually have a little power and say, no, you have to talk with us, you have to work with us. Because what we're doing is fighting not just for our constituents, we are literally fighting in this bicentennial year, we've been on for 200 years, for the very democracy that we so love, that we're here because we know how important it is that we're part of it, right? We are very fighting for really our very foundation of who we stand for and what we are. So I wanted to share a few things on education bills. So in front of you all, you guys can see that I'm going to talk about 2 things real quick: voting rights and the education legislation. Voting, and I put the bill numbers here, some of the most egregious bills that are out there. But the voter identification, this has been a thing for years. They actually have required you to, I don't know, maybe give like a DNA and stuff. It's right. But here's why, one of the reasons why photo ID is so problematic. Obviously, there's a vast majority of people who don't have a photo ID. It's because they are either elderly, they are African American, they are a person of color, or they're a person who's experiencing homelessness. Okay? In order to get any of your documents today, so let's say you need to go back and get a social security card or a birth certificate, our wait in vital records, if you were to have all of that information, is an 8 to 10 week backlog, because we do not pay our state workers, and they have either left for the private sector or they've left to work for one of our 8 border states. Okay? So for vital records, and I say this because I just told a constituent the other day who needed, you have to sign the parental affidavit if you don't have, if you aren't married at the time that the baby is born, then you have to sign this parental affidavit in order to get the father and the mother's name on the birth certificate. It's an 8 to 10 week backlog. Okay? So when they talk to me, and Jay Ashcroft and I just had this conversation the other day, heated at times, to say the least, but, and I said, wait, you're going to say that you're going to require all of these documents in order to get a photo ID, Even though, in order to vote today, you can show up with your voter registration card, right? There's a lot of other permissible things. We know that that person is you. That's not good enough anymore. So, obviously the photo ID that's been problematic for a long time, but even almost more problematic than some of that, which I know is crazy, is taking away almost all of absentee voting. So those of you who show up ahead of time because maybe you're out of town, they're trying to strip that. All of the mail-in for people who can't get out, so your ballot is mailed to you, that's trying to be removed. The initiative petition process is under attack in a way that we have never seen. So it's been around for over 115 years, used by conservatives when Democrats were in power, used by progressives to do things like Medicaid expansion, to fight to raise the minimum wage, right? For medical marijuana, or to repeal, well, I should say first for Queen, Missouri, and then essentially they did the same thing to gut it. To fight right to work for less. We've used the initiative petition process for all of these things. What they're doing today is saying, wait, it doesn't matter if you just have people in Kansas City and St. Louis metropolitan areas. You now need to go into those rural counties that have a couple hundred people and gather signatures there. So what they're putting in place for the initiative petition process would make it so difficult, first of all, to gather signatures in all 8 congressional districts. It would make that process millions of dollars more expensive. But also to say in order to pass, it would have to pass with a 2/3 majority. Okay? Education. So now, on a lighter note, let's talk about education. When I was listening to the stories before, and you hear stories, and when I say post-Brown, first ward, and when schools were starting to get segregated, desegregated, I hear these stories and I think, wow, we are back in the minds of the people who are introducing this legislation. They don't even want to talk about that, right? They don't want to talk about Jim Crow. They don't want to talk about Brown v. Board. They don't want to talk about anything because, as one of my colleagues said the other day to me, as I was inquiring of him in his egregious bill, we need to go back to the colorblind approach. Color doesn't matter. That's what they are preaching. And what's scary about it is with the power of legislation to get it done and the numbers to get it done at many times. So, colorblind approach, and I said, okay, let me dig into that. Here's why I find that problematic, right? It is our diversity. That's our strength. It matters that I am a woman representing Clay County when there's 6 other men. I bring different experiences to this job. You bring different experiences to your job because of what your lived experience. But my friend Rasheen Aldridge, who was in the protest, he took to the streets, he closed out many highways after Ferguson. He was in that fight on the streets and still on that fight today for the Fight for 15. Why his story matters. And why my friend Kevin Windham, who was one of the youngest men ever elected to the Missouri House, worked for the Government Council for a time, came back and decided to take a seat. Incredibly, you talk about somebody who does their homework, that man, I've never seen somebody come more prepared. Young black man who actually reads every single piece of legislation that comes before him, and then is inquiring of a white colleague, a white woman from the southern part of the state, about a bill to arm more people at schools, is what the bill was, right? That every staff member who works at a school should be able to carry a concealed weapon. As he's inquiring of her and asking her these questions, she's getting frustrated. How dare you question me? How dare you question my inquiry? How dare you question this bill? And this young man kept digging in. And she said, Mr. Speaker, I yield the inquiry. And there was an audible gasp, because never had somebody been treated with such disrespect of a fellow legislator. for somebody to say, no, I won't even answer questions from you people, is what she was saying on my bill. That's what's happening in Jefferson City today. And when you talk about education and whether, we really embrace this is about truth in teaching. This is about honesty in education. We can't look, here's the bicentennial of Missouri, the good, the bad, the ugly, including things like the Dred Scott decision, right? How do we move forward when we can't even acknowledge what's happening in Missouri? And you try to bring up Dred Scott, and they're like, oh, we're still talking about that. That's over. We're in this post-racial society, right? So, book bans, yes, we've got banning, essentially a rubber stamp curriculum to make sure there's no critical discussion. That's happening. Changes to teacher certification, yes. Right? As long as you have a bachelor's degree, you can teach. You don't need a certification. Expanding school voucher programs or neo-voucher programs, funneling more tax dollars into voucher programs is happening. And then just expansion of charter schools and virtual schools. That's a big one too. So I put some of the most egregious bills there. What's tricky is obviously CRT, people started to realize like, oh wait, CRT, maybe that really isn't happening. So we just need to say, well, anything that touches diversity, equity, and inclusion, we need to make sure that that goes away, right? Obviously with the 1619 project, I remember sharing with some of my colleagues, like, gosh, listen to that podcast, it's beautiful. You're going to learn so much. And they thought, oh my gosh, I can't do that. And this is literally their words, like that questions my history. That's what education's about, right? So, with that being said, it's one egregious thing after another, but here's where I have to leave on a kind of a positive, in that we are not alone. There are incredible coalitions forming from all over the state. I've talked with more students who are there to testify in opposition to legislation, parents, aunts, uncles, grandparents. There are people who said, I have never been into this Capitol before. Unfortunately, it's the people's house. I said, yeah, I'm here today to defend democracy. I'm here today to stand up against the dismantling of public education. So here's some awesome groups. I'm going to say this first before I tell you how to follow these pieces of legislation. Jobs and Justice continues to do incredible work in Missouri, so follow these groups. Missouri Equity Education Partnership. Heather Fleming is one of the leaders of this group and is one of the wisest women of the state and one of the bravest women of the state, because she's going out and literally, I receive attack emails to my house email about Heather Fleming every single day. Because how dare she stand for equity and inclusion in this state? How dare she leave her job as a single black mother and a teacher to fight for equity, diversity, and inclusion in the state? But we receive hate mail against this woman and her work. The House Democratic Campaign Committee, we have open seats for the first time in a long time. Clay County and Platte County are growing, and we have the opportunity to add 2 additional Democratic members of the Northland here. We talk about building a bench and what that means, why it matters to run for city or for school boards, for city council, right? We don't just need U.S. senators and congressmen and women. We need people in the state house. So the House Democratic Committee is doing incredible work for the bench. The work of the Missouri NAACP is unbelievable. They have been on the steps of the Supreme Court, on the steps of the Missouri Capitol. They've been some of the leaders in not only just helping us fight all the voting bans, but also they've done incredible work, like making sure once we did expand Medicaid expansion, that we continue to rally behind making sure that was properly implemented and funded. Empower Missouri is another awesome group. And then finally the Missouri Budget Project, and here's why that group matters. Our budget for the fiscal year 23 is a $47 billion budget. Now a lot of people might think, oh, Missouri budget, yeah, we have to pay for, I don't know, roads and bridges and schools. Hopefully they're getting funding in there somewhere. Why it matters is because there are a lot of other interests going after that money. While we continue to be the last in the nation in terms of what we put in the state in general revenue to education. We continue to be the last in the nation in what we put into the state for public health. The last in the nation, I mean, it goes on and on, right? Like we play a joke that Missouri is last in the nation in, like Illinois, because unfortunately we're there. Because for far too long, people were not either, I think it was twofold, kept out of the state house, not welcome to the state house, not represented by legislators who actually cared and were there for the right reason. That was part of it. But also, we have been in the last 20 years, the pendulum went so, we were, right, the Democrats had power for a very long time, we were pretty moderate, we were the purple state for a good decade. And then we went radically to the right very quickly because of gerrymandering. Because of an incredible amount of power and dark money into elections. And thankfully, we're to the time where you think we've hit the bottom, like we've got to be coming back up. But honestly, last year there was one seat that, or I should say 2020, there was one seat that flipped in the Missouri House, and all of the 163, that was one seat that flipped by 80 votes in Springfield, Missouri. Betsy Fogel became the first Democrat to represent that seat for a very, I think, in a very long time. Okay? So there is, and I hope you recognize that there is something beautiful about gathering with people, even on a Sunday afternoon, right? There's something beautiful in gathering with people who share our same interests, our values, but also that fight, that inner whatever inner flame you have, knowing that we have to do better. Not because of just where we are right now, but where we want to see Missouri go. Okay? So with that, I'm happy, I don't know, yeah.
Out there, you have 2 minutes
Yep.
to answer some questions. We'd like you all to take advantage of this opportunity and ask any questions you might have of Maggie.
Yeah.
From Liberty, Mark Elbrock is our rep. Do you have much contact with him?
So yes, and that he is a member of the Democratic Caucus. I don't know if the caucus is with us, to be honest, but we vote very differently a lot of times. So things like the Second Amendment Preservation Act, I did not vote for that, and he did. So with that being said, he also, though, he's somebody who I hope that you all invite him in, or that to learn and to listen from others. But yes, so Mark, yes, I should say.
I've known him pretty well. My oldest son graduated with him.
Yeah.
And I was very shocked one time. We had a Sierra Club meeting, and he was there, and many of us, and just asking questions, blah, blah, blah. He was on board, and then all of a sudden, down there, a bill came up, and he voted against, and I confronted him. And it was basically like, well, you know, sometimes to get something through, we have to compromise with a colleague. And I thought, oh my, I don't like that.
Yeah, and I don't know about that particular piece of legislation. Yeah. But with that being said, I think it is, if you have the time, I ask that you hold us responsible, right? So if you know, make sure if we're saying one thing here and then doing something else, right, is we should be held accountable. Like, good government dies in darkness. Transparency and accountability is the number one thing. So a lot of times, are there weird things? I just had a conversation yesterday at the event as to why I had to vote on the budget bill. And I said, yeah, because it was part of a bigger plan. We knew that we had to vote present in one situation. We knew that we had to get this pay raise for our state workers, and I wasn't going to vote for a low pay rate, or not like a minimal, right? So with that being said, sometimes votes are a little bit tricky as to what there is and what the negotiations are, but ask. Ask why. I remember last year was a biodiesel thing. Missouri you can still be fired for being gay. You can still be denied housing for being gay in the state of Missouri, right? We are one of the states that does not have a Non-Discrimination Act that protects sexual orientation. So we have, for I think it's the 21st or 22nd year, it's called NONA, Missouri Non-Discrimination Act is being introduced. Last year, we had to pull that bill out of committee by ourselves. If you get so many people to do that, you can actually take it away from the control of the speaker, from the chair of that committee, and we did that. And in doing that, they said, okay, we're not going to put this bill on the floor. Or in doing that, we're not going to do this bill, right? So there was so we actually got penalized because we kind of went around and we used this House rule to pull this bill off the floor, but then a bill that we really liked didn't see the light of day. So it's interesting how things happen, and again, I don't know what that one was, but what I want to say again, just to reiterate, is it's so important that we're held accountable, that what we're doing is transparent. And then my contact information's on there too. I know it's getting late, so feel free to reach out. That's my office number, and I'm happy to give anybody my cell who wants it too. But that's my house email. But please follow along. Please, you don't have to go to Jeff City. I know it's a 2.5 hour drive from here. All hearings are broadcasted live, and if you are not there to watch it live, they're archived. Okay? Testimony, thankfully we accept written testimony. You can submit a testimony on any of these bills at any time, okay? You can write the people that are on the committee. So please use your voice. We need your advocacy because we need to hear from people who don't think that all of this is just peachy.
Thank you so much, Maggie, for taking this advantage.
Thank you all. No, more importantly, thank you all for showing up. Appreciate it.
You know, I don't know if you participated in speaking today, you would have been seeing Janice. All right. Well, that's kind of how we're going to conclude this day. I hope that this was a day of enlightenment and something that will help give us some grip, right? That's for you, sir. And so if we can grip the truth, we can grip our humanity and our collective humanity that we have together and go forward into whatever this process is we're going to be engaged in locally and as a nation to make things better for everybody, so that we can let go of some of the garbage that needs to be let go of and clean some things up. Tangibly, one of the things is to remove that monument. That's a tangible example of what. So I want to thank Maggie and Troy. Thank you very much for being here, and they ad-libbed for us to come in and take care of the microphone work so that we can hear audibly. It helps me as I grow. I have to be closer. So I thank you for allowing us to be here and providing this opportunity for us. Maggie and Troy run the Corbin Theater program, and so pay attention to their literature too, because you can come in and see some wonderful theatrical experiences and hear some great music by the young people and local people around here. So with that, okay, oh, I'm sorry, yes, if you did fill out any of these, the paperwork that we handed out, just leave it on the table. We will pick those things up as we leave, so we can get ready to transition into the corporate theater program tonight. So thank you again, everybody, and have a great rest of the day.